Greetings, I'm Shad, and this is a reply to the mighty, the magnanimous, the magnificent Metatron. Once upon a time, I made a video. And by once upon a time, I mean a couple of weeks ago, because that's when the video was made. But it was about medieval weapons for women, and the Metatron really liked the video, and he wanted to share some additional thoughts he had on the subject. And after watching his video, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I really do recommend you watch it, previous to watching this video, I also have some thoughts to share. And as a kind of a side note to this, I just want to point out how awesome this is. I love being able to discuss the things that I love, and so when a super nerd comes along like myself, and sorry Raph, you are a super nerd, but that is a badge to be worn with pride. And so really, this video is kind of just me and Raph having a nerd out. We're just talking about things we love. And the additional thing that Raffaello wanted to mention, who is the Metatron, was this, is that he felt a longsword might not be the very best pick for a person who has less physical strength than most of the warriors they'll be fighting, because he agreed with me in the sense that using two hands meant that whatever weapon you're originally using in one hand now feels lighter because you're using two hands. He felt you should take it an additional step, because if a longsword being used with two hands feels lighter than a one-handed sword being used with one hand, well then of course a one-handed sword being used with two hands will feel even lighter again. And I agree with him completely. And interestingly, in the same way that he reached a different conclusion with the same kind of information that he was analysing, I have a bit of a different conclusion that I'm reaching with the information that I'm analysing that he has proposed. And another quick segue, this is an important thing to kind of point out, because I've actually met a lot of people who don't understand this principle that two different people who are presented with the exact same information, and they understand it the exact same way, with the context all in place and everything like that, it is still possible for these two people to reach different conclusions. Now, oftentimes when you're having a discussion and people are presenting information and one person isn't agreeing with the other, they will say, well, you just don't understand what I'm talking about. That's not always true. Sometimes they understand completely what the other person is talking about, and they're just reaching a different conclusion. That is what is called opinion. And everyone has it, and they're perfectly entitled to it. And instead of being worried or even affronted by the fact that someone disagrees with you, that's actually an opportunity for not only having a discussion, but also a nerd out session. Because me and Raph, we love swords, and if an interesting topic comes up, we love talking about swords. And that's exactly what we'll be doing here, and I just wanted to kind of point it out because I go off on tangents all the time and you just have to get used to it. Squirrel! He got away. Damn squirrels. So I feel there is one last point that has not been addressed in regards to this discussion that we're having, two hands with a longsword or two hands with a one-handed arming sword, which would be better. Well, the matter that I feel is still unresolved is the matter of leverage. And to discuss my thoughts in regards to this, I need to be standing. To begin with, just doing some very quick analysis of the inertia that I'm feeling as I wave this sword back and forth, and then comparing that to grabbing the sword with, like, one-handed sword with two hands, and comparing the difference, big difference. Alright, so I'll try and do it as fast as I can, and gee, the inertia is fighting against it, but then if I do it this, much faster. So already the two hands is giving me far more leverage than I had before, but also I have more muscle that I'm able to put into redirecting this sword's momentum than I did before, which means a lot faster. Those very principles will be coming into play with a longsword, but there's a big difference where before I had to hold the sword, like the one-handed sword, like this. The hands were quite close together. With a longsword, I can put them further apart. And for myself, and really I think this is the best way to grab a longsword, is to cup the pommel. In my own opinion, the optimal way to grab the bottom of the sword is to grab it right there. So see the cushion underneath my thumb? That goes above the pommel, and it sits there beautifully, very nicely, and right over. The longsword does weigh more than the one-handed arming sword, but my question is that because you can grasp the sword with your hands much further apart, does this additional leverage offset the additional weight that the longsword has? So just to test, what it feels like, to me it actually feels even lighter than when I was trying it with the one-handed arming sword. This leverage is just, it makes a huge difference. And this then brings us to another logical question. Okay, if leverage is so good, well then why don't we just put a two-handed length sword grip on a one-handed length blade?
and the closest sword that fits this description would be the bastard sword. Well, my first thought about this is that shorter blades aren't necessarily always lighter. It depends on how thick they are. You can have long sword length blades that actually weigh equivalent to arming sword length blades, because the blades on the arming swords are thicker and the blade, just in this example, on the longsword can be thinner. And so if weight is the concern, well, that's not really an issue, because there is so much variance in longsword design that you can easily find a longsword blade that is easily equivalent in weight to an arming sword. You have to remember that the additional weight on a longsword can not only come from the additional length on the blade, but also the additional length of the handle, and the crossguards are generally a bit wider as well. So if you're going to lengthen the handle of a one-handed sword to make it two-handed and keep the blade length the same, you are still increasing weight. But if we put that aside and just assume that the shorter blade will be lighter, it's not always the case, just like I've explained. But if we were to say, okay, what if it was? My question then is, does the reduction in the weight of the blade, which then makes it easier to use for a weaker person, does this advantage of it being more slightly easy to use offset the loss of the advantage from the reach? Because reach is a profoundly significant advantage, and in my opinion, it's more than just a tactical advantage. If you have a weapon that has reach, it is an inherent quality of the weapon itself, which can then provide a huge benefit to the user. And if you are someone who has less physical strength, you would actually want to keep your opponents as far away from you as possible, because one of their biggest, problems you will have if you're ever fighting anyone and you're physically weaker is in grappling. If someone grabs you and they are stronger than you, you are screwed. I know technique can help out a lot, but trust me, when it comes to grappling, physical strength plays a big role. So in this sense, I can see that reach could be more important than having the weapon be a little bit lighter. But this is very hard to gauge specifically, because what is more advantageous? What's the pros and cons on each side? You need to measure it exactly, and then you have individual parameters, and so it just gets confusing. Because the reality is, the greater maneuverability and speed you would get out of having the sword being a little bit lighter could be very effective, and it might be even more beneficial than having that a little bit of greater reach. So this point would probably come down to personal preference. And for myself, again, I'm speaking as someone who is not generally perceived as a particularly weak person. Not particularly strong, but not particularly weak. I would always take a reach advantage if gaining that reach didn't offer too much detrimental effect on the sword overall, and if it's only a little increase in weight, not a problem.
Now, while I'm here, and while I'm comparing the differences in leverage and the inertia of one-handed swords and two-handed swords, I might as well try it with one hand. So, one hand on a one-handed sword, and one hand on a two-handed arming sword, just to compare the difference, because the longsword we would expect to be much more difficult to redirect with one hand, but it has more weight behind the hand, pummel as well. But the blade, is bigger as well. So just comparing it, longsword way more difficult. Like, it's not impossible. You could definitely use a longsword one hand easily, but I tell you, I don't like using a one-handed sword just because, by nature of the sword, you're required to kind of present how I fight. You don't always. There's a lot of different stances. But if I'm using a one-handed sword by itself, and I don't have a buckler, like if I'll present the buckler if I was holding that, but one-handed sword, I'll be doing this. And this requires so much more energy to maintain than this. Profoundly more so. When I try it, at least. I almost consider this a resting stance. I'm not exerting any energy, yet the sword is presented very forward, giving me good protection, whereas opposed to this, even if it was there, there's so much more stress on the wrist. Huge difference. And so this is one reason why I prefer the longsword so much more over a one-handed arming sword. You certainly get that advantage when you grab a one-handed sword with two hands, but still, having tested myself, the longsword feels lighter, and I can redirect it quicker, all because of leverage. So these are my thoughts in regards to this wonderful discussion that we're having. Now, I'll just also emphasize something that a lot of people seem to have missed in the original video that sparked this discussion, Best Medieval Weapons for Women, and I think it's because people don't watch the video all the way to the end. And that's the fact that as I've been thinking about this even more, I do really think probably the best weapon for a person with less strength, and that's more often women, would be the spear, alright? And I mentioned spears and polearms, but if you're on a battlefield, but for self-defense, it would be a longsword. And I stick to that, but people have then gone to think that I'm saying that the longsword is superior to the spear. No, I actually think the spear is the superior one, but it's impractical to carry the spear around with you constantly every single day. The longsword is or any sword is so convenient to carry around with you. That's why it became the weapon for self-defense. And out of all those swords then, I do think the longsword is the best pick. I also have some additional thoughts that I think is a good opportunity to talk with you, hence the subject that Raffaello has brought up and myself, which is the discussion of two-handed swords versus one-handed swords, which are better. And we've been talking about it in the context of what would be better for someone with less strength. I want to share some additional thoughts I've had just with strength out the window. Regular warrior of the day, what would be better for him to pick for self-defense? A one-handed sword or a two-handed sword? Now, I've made a whole video on this subject, okay, and I do encourage you to watch it if you're interested, but I've had some additional thoughts that have kind of changed my views since making this video. In the video, I shared that my opinion then was that I felt one-handed swords with a weapon for, defense, offense, whatever, if it was a dagger, a buckler, always held the edge. And even, especially so, I said if you could get a shield, a proper size shield, especially a kite shield, you would be able to just trounce, absolutely destroy a guy who was using a longsword. And in that sense, I gave one-handed swords the edge. And that was in the context of being unarmoured, okay? And so being unarmoured, for self-defense, you wouldn't really be carrying a shield around, just like you wouldn't be carrying a spear. But very often people carry bucklers. And then I was wondering which had the edge, and I still gave the edge to sword and buckler over two-handed longsword. Now my thinking has changed. I really feel those two disciplines are far closer in their effectiveness than I was really thinking back then. And this is from practicing it myself, using both sword and buckler, longsword, figuring out how they work, which has the advantage. And I did that before, but I've been doing it more and more, and it's evolved my thinking. And so at the moment, I really do feel the longsword is almost directly equivalent to sword and buckler, and who would really win comes right down to whoever has the most skill or advantage in any number of things, okay? Speed, alright, reach, being tall in height, huge advantage, more than people might realise. Also just brute strength as well. Any number of these things come into play that can give someone the advantage. And whoever has those advantages and is generally more skillful will win, regardless of sword and buckler or a two-handed longsword. And my experience even goes a bit further in this. I actually think, for myself, so far, I'm still going to be practicing, figuring out, but thanks to LARP, I've been able to fight a lot of people who use arming sword, around length, and heater shields, strapped-on heater shields. And I even tried it, alright, and it was horrible. Fighting on foot with a strapped-on heater shield, it almost makes me blind on my left side, and my bottom leg, is amazing. And so whenever I'm fighting someone, I perform orders of magnitude almost. Hyperbole, okay? But so much better with my longsword than with a sword and shield in this sense. And I find it very, very easy to beat the guys I'm fighting with who are using sword and shield, when I generally thought that should have given them a huge advantage. Well, because it's strapped onto their arm and they have to hold it close to their body and they have less maneuverability and they and they don't see their bottom leg, so they're not protecting it, and they're, not raising it. If, you're not supposed to hit in the head in LARP, and so that means they never properly try and protect it, but if they did, they would raise it, leave them open, stuff like that. Anyway, nowhere near the huge advantage that I thought, and with longsword, beat them easily. It's not to say guys didn't beat me, they did, but I'm talking about in general, on average. And so if I was to pick which one would give me the best chances of winning, well, even if there is, say, an advantage in sword and shield, right? I am so much more proficient and competent with longsword, especially for the reasons of the one-handed, arming sword, because I find it more stress on the wrist, more tiring. Longsword is a far better pick for me, even if there was more advantages, because my personal skill and proficiency in the longsword outweighs any advantage I could get with that shield if it's strapped on, and then the proficiency I have in that combo is so much less. And so these are my updated thoughts in regards to one-handed versus two-handed swords. And I just felt it was appropriate to share them because this is that's the topic of the video, one-handed versus two-handed, with different context, for weaker people and for normal average strength warriors.
An additional thing to clarify that some people have been suggesting is that why haven't I mentioned sword and shield as a really effective option for people with less strength? Because if they have less strength, they would need more protection, and the shield offers some of the best protection you can get. Well, if the shield is large, I'm not the heater shield as I've talked about in the video, but I'm talking about a proper sized large shield, good kite shield, or a big large Viking shield. Well, from my own practice with these shields, and I made a couple, you've probably seen them in other videos, though they are far light than many people think, I made them to be light but strong, my goodness, even with them being light, okay, you hold them out in front of you long enough, they start to feel very heavy. And for someone who doesn't have a lot of strength, oh gee, they're not going to last long using the sword and shield together. Those two weapons will just weigh their arms down to the point that they'll be very ineffective in fighting with them. So no, I don't actually think sword and shield is a good combination for someone with less strength.
And there you go, those have been my thoughts on the subjects we have discussed. If you've never heard of the Metatron or his YouTube channel before, you need to go and check out his content. He is just an awesome guy. He makes just awesome content. You need to subscribe and you're going to learn heaps from him. I have learned heaps from him. Raf has particular expertise in Roman history, also in linguistics, languages, and Japanese culture, weapons, armor, and warfare. So he can provide you so many things that I can't, and these are the things that I go to him to learn about, so you really need to also, like I said, subscribe and enjoy his just phenomenal content. And also, thank you, Raffaello, for making your awesome reply video that led to me questioning my own assumptions, having wonderful internal thought processes as I considered the pros and cons of everything that was being said, and also which led us all into having this awesome discussion. And thank you for watching. I do hope you have enjoyed. Please share your comments and thoughts below. And until next time, all the best and farewell.